The morning of February 23, 1945, near the approaches to the Roer River in Germany's industrial heartland, Staff Sergeant Eugene Luciano watched through his periscope as the muzzle flash erupted from a concealed German anti-tank position roughly 400 yards distant. The 75mm armor-piercing round struck his M4 Sherman with a metallic crack that reverberated through the fighting compartment. Luciano felt the impact through his boots, heard the penetrator screaming through empty air inside the turret, watched it exit cleanly through the opposite side of the hull. What didn't happen in the seconds that followed represented a quiet revolution in armored warfare that would save thousands of American lives before war's end, though few tankers would ever know the specific engineering decisions that kept them breathing. The Sherman didn't burn. The crew didn't bail out into machine gun fire. The loader didn't scream as ammunition cooked off in cascading sympathetic detonations. The driver maintained his position. The gunner traversed left, seeking the source of the shot. Luciano's tank had been penetrated by a German anti-tank gun at combat range, survived the hit, and remained in the fight. This outcome would have been statistically improbable, perhaps impossible, just 8 months earlier, when American armored forces first encountered German defensive positions in Normandy's hedgerow country. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The difference between Luciano's survival and the fate of countless crews before him came down to a modification so simple in concept, so difficult in implementation, and so crucial in consequence that it fundamentally altered the tactical calculus of armoured combat in the European theatre. American tankers called Shermans that burned after penetration Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan promised it, lights the first time, every time. German tank crews used the term Tommy Cooker. The French resistance fighters, watching American tanks brew up in the Norman countryside, called them flaming coffins. By February 1945, these grim nicknames had become largely obsolete, replaced by a technical modification that most combat soldiers never fully understood, but whose presence meant the difference between probable death and probable survival when armor-piercing shot found its mark. The Sherman tank's propensity to catastrophically burn following armor penetration had become the American armored forces' most pressing tactical and psychological crisis by the summer of 1944. Tank crews understood intellectually that their vehicles offered better protection than infantry faced in open ground, provided superior firepower, and enabled maneuver warfare that reduced overall casualties across entire operations. They also understood, through direct observation and the testimony of survivors, that a penetrating hit frequently resulted in immediate conflagration that killed or horrifically burned crew members trapped inside a vehicle, whose exits became furnace doors. This knowledge created psychological pressure that affected crew performance, tactical decision-making, and the willingness of replacement crews to accept assignment to armored units. The technical problem that created Sherman fires was understood clearly by American ordnance engineers, British tank designers, and German intelligence officers analyzing captured vehicles. The solution, however, required manufacturing changes, supply chain modifications, and field retrofits across thousands of vehicles operating in active combat theaters. The story of how American industry and military logistics solved this crisis reveals the unglamorous but essential relationship between engineering, competence, industrial capacity, and battlefield survival that characterized the American approach to armored warfare during World War II. The M4 Sherman medium tank entered American armored service in 1942 as a fundamentally sound design that incorporated lessons learned from early war combat observations, British experience in North Africa, and American assessments of German armored doctrine. The tank featured a welded hull constructed from rolled homogeneous armor plate, a traversable turret mounting a 75mm main gun, a reliable mechanical components derived from proven automotive technology, and crew accommodations for 5 men, including commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver, who also operated the bow-mounted machine gun. The Sherman's design philosophy emphasized reliability, ease of manufacture, maintainability under field conditions, and adequate protection against the anti-tank threats American planners anticipated facing in 1942. This philosophy produced a vehicle that could be manufactured in enormous quantities by multiple manufacturers using standardized components, shipped across oceans in available cargo vessels, maintained by crews with reasonable mechanical aptitude using available tools and parts, and operated effectively by adequately trained crews under most combat conditions. American ordnance officials considered this combination of characteristics more valuable strategically than pursuing maximum armor protection or gun performance that might compromise reliability, complicate production, or create maintenance difficulties. Initial Sherman combat experience in North Africa during 1942 and 1943 generally validated these design priorities. The tank proved mechanically reliable across difficult terrain and harsh environmental conditions. Crews could perform routine maintenance and minor repairs without specialized equipment. The 75mm gun provided adequate firepower against German armor encountered during that period. Armor protection proved sufficient against most German anti-tank weapons at typical combat range. The tank performed its intended mission of supporting infantry, exploiting breakthroughs, and engaging enemy armor under circumstances where American numerical superiority and air dominance created favorable tactical conditions. However, North African combat also revealed a troubling characteristic that would become catastrophically significant during later campaigns in Europe. Shermans that suffered armor penetration from German anti-tank guns frequently experienced immediate fires that rapidly engulfed the fighting compartment. Crew survival rates following penetration were disturbingly low compared to crews in other armored vehicles. Survivors reported that fires began almost instantaneously after penetration, spreading so rapidly that escape through turret or hull hatches became impossible before flames blocked exits or incapacitated crew members. American and British investigators examining knocked-out Shermans in North Africa identified the primary cause of these catastrophic fires through systematic analysis of burned-out hulls and survivor testimony. The Sherman's main gun ammunition was stowed in sponsons along the sides of the hull, positioned at approximately the same height as the turret ring and directly in the path of penetrating projectiles entering the vehicle's sides. These sponson racks held 75mm rounds in vertical positions, with projectiles pointing upward and propellant charges exposed to the fighting compartment's interior atmosphere. When armor-piercing shot penetrated the hull and struck ammunition stowed in these sponsons, the impact often ruptured propellant cases or ignited propellant through friction and heat. A single round igniting would immediately spread fire to adjacent ammunition in the same rack. The propellant burned with intense heat in the confined space of the fighting compartment, rapidly consuming available oxygen while producing toxic gases. Crew members attempting to escape faced flames blocking hatches, smoke obscuring vision, searing heat that caused immediate burns to exposed skin and respiratory tissue, and the imminent danger of complete ammunition detonation as fire spread throughout stored rounds. American armored doctrine in 1943 emphasized mobility, combined arms coordination, and numerical superiority rather than seeking parity in armor protection or gun performance with German heavy tanks. This doctrinal framework reflected realistic assessments of American industrial capabilities, strategic priorities, and tactical requirements. American planners understood that Sherman tanks could be produced in quantities that German industry could never match, shipped across oceans using available logistics, and maintained in forward areas without the specialized support German heavy tanks required. The doctrine accepted that individual Sherman tanks might prove inferior to German Panthers or Tigers in direct engagements, but emphasized that American forces would never fight fair, always bringing superior numbers, artillery support, air power, and infantry coordination to overwhelm German defenders. This doctrine possessed considerable strategic merit and reflected sound understanding of America's comparative advantages in industrial production and logistics. However, it created psychological difficulties for tank crews, who understood intellectually that their role in larger operations made strategic sense, while simultaneously facing the tactical reality that their individual vehicles were outmatched in armor and firepower by German tanks they might encounter. The knowledge that Shermans burned catastrophically when penetrated intensified these psychological pressures considerably. Tank crews developed informal tactical response to minimize fire risk based on combat experience and unit-level knowledge sharing. Crews learned to engage from hull-down positions whenever possible, exposing only the turret while keeping the more vulnerable hull behind cover. They avoided presenting the tank's side armor to known or suspected German positions, understanding that side penetrations most frequently resulted in ammunition fires. Some crews removed portions of their stored ammunition, reducing available rounds to decrease fire probability, even though this compromise reduced sustained combat capability. Crews rehearsed bailout procedures obsessively, practicing rapid exit through hatches until every crew member could escape within seconds of the commander's order. These tactical adaptations reduced fire casualties somewhat, but could not eliminate the fundamental vulnerability created by ammunition stowage design. Tank crews operating in close terrain, where German anti-tank guns could engage at short ranges from concealed positions, faced unavoidable risk. The Normandy hedgerow fighting during summer 1944 exposed this vulnerability with brutal clarity as German defensive tactics specifically exploited Sherman weaknesses. German anti-tank doctrine emphasized allowing American armor to close to ranges under 400 yards, where even lighter anti-tank guns could reliably penetrate Sherman armor, particularly the thinner side plates. German gunners were specifically trained to aim for the hull sides where ammunition sponsons were located, knowing that penetrations in this area frequently resulted in catastrophic vehicle loss and crew casualties. This tactical approach proved devastatingly effective in Normandy's restricted terrain, where American tanks frequently had to advance along narrow lanes bordered by thick hedgerows that prevented maneuver and channeled movement into kill zones. American armored casualties during the Normandy campaign reached levels that alarmed commanders and devastated morale among replacement crews. Tank units reported that crew members increasingly viewed assignment to Shermans as near-certain death sentences. Replacement crews arriving at frontline units sometimes discovered they were filling positions in tanks where previous crews had burned to death days earlier. The psychological impact of climbing into a fighting compartment, still bearing scorch marks, and the smell of burned flesh cannot be overstated in its effect on combat effectiveness and crew cohesion. American ordnance engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland had understood the ammunition fire problem since early 1943, but developing an effective solution required overcoming substantial technical and logistical challenges. The fundamental issue was straightforward. Propellant charges for 75mm ammunition were highly flammable when exposed to impact, sparks, or fragments from penetrating projectiles. Traditional ammunition stowage placed rounds in racks throughout the fighting compartment where they remained vulnerable to any penetration. The solution required either relocating ammunition to less vulnerable positions or protecting stored rounds from ignition when penetrators entered the vehicle. Relocating ammunition presented serious difficulties, given the Sherman's existing internal layout and the volume of rounds the tank needed to carry for sustained combat operations. The 75mm gun required separate loading ammunition with projectile and propellant charge loaded individually. Each complete round occupied considerable space. Combat experience indicated that crews needed approximately 70 to 90 rounds for typical engagement durations. Storing this quantity required using available space throughout the hull, inevitably placing some ammunition in positions vulnerable to penetration. British tank designers working with similar problems had experimented with storing ammunition in water-jacketed containers that would prevent ignition even if penetrators struck and stored rounds. The water surrounding ammunition would absorb heat from impacts, cool fragments, and suppress ignition of propellant charges. Initial British tests demonstrated the concept's validity under laboratory conditions. Projectiles fired into water-jacketed ammunition containers failed to ignite propellant charge that would have ignited immediately under normal storage conditions. The water absorbed impact energy, cooled penetrating fragments to below ignition temperature, and created a barrier between burning material and unaffected rounds. American ordnance officials recognized that adapting this wet stowage concept for Sherman production required extensive engineering development, testing under realistic conditions, and coordination across multiple manufacturers and supply organizations. The modification would affect hull design, internal layout, ammunition handling procedures, crew training, and field maintenance requirements. Engineers at Aberdeen worked throughout late 1943 and early 1944, developing practical wet stowage systems that could be manufactured efficiently, installed in existing tank hulls, and maintained by field units without specialized equipment. The final wet stowage design relocated the majority of the Sherman's ammunition from vulnerable sponson racks to a new position on the hull floor beneath the turret basket. This floor location offered substantially better protection because penetrators entering through the hull sides would strike the more heavily armored lower hull before reaching stored ammunition. The new floor racks were constructed as sealed containers with double walls. Water filled the space between inner and outer walls, completely surrounding stored ammunition rounds. Each container held multiple rounds in vertical positions with water jackets, protecting them from all sides. The water capacity in these jackets was carefully calculated to provide sufficient thermal mass to absorb heat from penetrating fragments while remaining light enough to avoid compromising the tank's overall weight distribution and mobility. Engineers determined that approximately 3 gallons of water surrounding each group of stored rounds provided adequate protection based on penetration tests conducted at Aberdeen. The water was treated with ethylene glycol antifreeze to prevent freezing in cold weather conditions that American tanks would encounter during European winter operations. Seals prevented water loss during normal operations while allowing crews to inspect and refill containers during routine maintenance. Installing wet stowage required substantial modifications to existing Sherman hulls. Manufacturing facilities had to redesign hull floor structures to accommodate the new ammunition containers. Internal bracing was added to support the weight of water-filled containers. Turret basket configurations were modified to allow loader access to floor-mounted ammunition. Crews needed new procedures for loading ammunition from floor racks, rather than more conveniently positioned sponson storage. The modification reduced ready ammunition storage from approximately 90 rounds to 71 rounds in wet stowage positions, with additional rounds stored in less protected positions for emergency resupply. Production of wet stowage. Shermans began in March 1944 at manufacturing facilities operated by Chrysler, Fisher Body, Federal Machine and Welder, and Pacific Car and Foundry. These factories produced Sherman variants, including the M4 Sherman with cast hull, M4 Ado with General Motors diesel engines, and M4 Atroa with Ford GAA gasoline engines. Each variant received wet stowage modifications appropriate to its specific hull design and internal configuration. The modification added approximately 400 pounds to the tank's combat weight, a modest increase that did not significantly affect mobility or mechanical reliability. Field testing of wet stowage prototypes at Aberdeen Proving Ground during February and March 1944 provided quantitative evidence of the modification's effectiveness under simulated combat conditions. Engineers fired armor-piercing projectiles from German 75mm and 88mm anti-tank guns into Sherman hulls, equipped with both conventional dry stowage and new wet stowage systems. The tests used projectiles captured in North Africa and Italy to ensure realistic simulation of actual German anti-tank ammunition performance. Results from these tests demonstrated dramatic improvements in fire resistance. Sherman hulls with conventional dry sponson stowage suffered ammunition fires in approximately 80% of trials, where penetrating projectiles struck stored ammunition directly. The propellant ignited almost instantaneously, typically within 1 to 3 seconds of penetration. Fires spread rapidly throughout the fighting compartment as adjacent rounds ignited in sympathetic detonation. Complete vehicle loss through fire occurred in most cases within 30 to 45 seconds of initial penetration. Sherman hulls equipped with wet stowage demonstrated fundamentally different outcomes under identical test conditions. Penetrating projectiles that struck water-jacketed ammunition containers failed to ignite stored propellant in approximately 85 to 90% of trials. The water jacket absorbed impact energy and cooled penetrating fragments below the ignition temperature of propellant charges. In cases where ignition did occur, fires developed much more slowly, typically requiring 15 to 30 seconds before spreading beyond the initially affected container. This delayed fire development provided crews substantially more time to suppress fires using onboard extinguishers or evacuate the vehicle before conditions became unsurvivable. The statistical improvement, represented by wet stowage, was clear and compelling. A Sherman crew, whose tank suffered ammunition penetration, had roughly an 80% probability of immediate catastrophic fire with dry stowage. That same crew in a wet stowage tank had approximately a 10 to 15% probability of fire following identical penetration. This represented approximately an 8-fold reduction in fire probability, translating directly into dramatically improved crew survival rates and vehicle recovery rates following combat damage. However, these promising test results meant nothing to tank crews fighting in Normandy during June and July 1944 because wet stowage Shermans had not yet reached frontline units in sufficient quantities. The first wet stowage tanks arrived in France during late July 1944 as replacement vehicles for units that had suffered heavy losses during the initial hedgerow fighting. Crews receiving these modified tanks typically did not understand the significance of the wet stowage modification or how it functionally differed from earlier vehicles. Tactical bulletins distributed to armoured units described the modification only briefly, focusing on the relocated ammunition racks and changed loading procedures rather than explaining the fire protection mechanism. Tank crews adapted to the modified ammunition stowage arrangements with typical soldier pragmatism. Loaders complained initially about the less convenient floor-mounted racks that required bending down to retrieve rounds rather than simply turning to sponson racks at shoulder height. Some crews removed ammunition from wet stowage containers and returned it to the now empty sponson racks, seeking faster loading times and negating the fire protection the modification provided. Unit commanders had to specifically prohibit this practice and enforce proper ammunition stowage in wet containers, though explaining the specific reason for this requirement proved difficult when crews had not yet observed the modification's protective effect. The effectiveness of wet stowage became apparent gradually through statistical analysis rather than dramatic individual incidents. Armoured units equipped with wet stowage, Shermans reported substantially fewer total vehicle loss to fire following penetration compared to units still operating earlier dry stowage tanks. After-action reports from units that suffered armour penetrations increasingly noted that vehicles remained operational after hits that would have caused catastrophic fires in earlier Shermans. Crews reported successfully fighting fires that began after penetration, suppressing them before complete vehicle loss occurred. Recovery units reported retrieving substantially more damaged but repairable tanks rather than complete burnout hulls. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Systematic analysis of tank losses conducted by U.S. Army operational research teams during fall 1944 provided quantitative confirmation of wet stowage effectiveness under actual combat conditions. These analysts examined damage reports, crew casualty records, and vehicle recovery data from armoured units operating in France and Germany during the period from August through November 1944. The data distinguished between losses suffered by tanks with dry stowage and losses among wet stowage-equipped vehicles. The operational research findings, compiled in reports distributed to armoured commanders during December 1944, revealed the magnitude of wet stowage's impact on crew survival and vehicle loss rates. Shermans equipped with dry ammunition stowage that suffered armour penetration experienced catastrophic fires, requiring complete vehicle abandonment in approximately 60 to 65% of cases. Crew casualties in these incidents were severe, with average crew losses of 3 to 4 men killed or critically wounded per vehicle. The remaining 35 to 40% of penetrated dry stowage tanks typically suffered fires that crews managed to suppress or evacuate before becoming completely involved, though these vehicles still frequently required extensive repair before returning to service. Shermans, equipped with wet ammunition stowage, demonstrated dramatically different outcomes. Vehicles that suffered armor penetration experienced catastrophic fires in only approximately 10 to 15% of cases. The remaining 85 to 90% of penetrated wet stowage tanks either experienced no fire at all or developed fires that crews could suppress using onboard extinguishers before serious damage occurred. Average crew casualties per penetrated vehicle dropped to less than 1 man killed or seriously wounded. Vehicle recovery rates improved substantially as damaged tanks could often be retrieved, repaired, and returned to service rather than being written off as total loss. These statistics represented the difference between probable death and probable survival for American tank crews facing German anti-tank weapons. A crew in a dry stowage Sherman penetrated by German armor-piercing shot had roughly a 65% chance of experiencing catastrophic fire and a very high probability of death or severe burns. That same crew in a wet stowage Sherman had roughly a 15% chance of catastrophic fire and dramatically improved survival probability even if penetration occurred. The psychological impact of this statistical reality on tank crews was profound once crews understood the modification's significance. Soldiers who had viewed Sherman assignment as near-certain death sentences gradually recognized that wet stowage dramatically improved their survival odds. Crews began specifically requesting assignment to wet stowage-equipped tanks. Unit maintenance personnel prioritized wet stowage vehicles for repair, returning them to service before working on damaged dry stowage tanks. Replacement crews arriving at frontline units asked explicitly whether available tanks featured wet stowage before accepting assignment. First Sergeant James Flowers of the 2nd Armored Division described the psychological shift in a letter written during January 1945 to his brother, also serving in Europe with an infantry unit. Flowers wrote that crews had initially dismissed the wet stowage modification as typical Army tinkering that complicated ammunition handling without providing real benefit. However, after several months of combat experience that included numerous penetrations where wet stowage tanks survived without catastrophic fires, crews had developed absolute faith in the modification's protective value. Flowers noted that his own tank had been penetrated twice during fighting in Belgium, both times by German anti-tank guns firing from close range. Both penetrations struck areas near ammunition stowage. Neither resulted in fire. His crew had suppressed minor smoke in one incident using hand extinguishers. The tank remained operational after both hits following field repairs to patch penetration holes. Tank commanders reported that wet stowage substantially affected tactical decision-making and crew confidence during engagements. Crews in dry stowage tanks had often prioritized immediate evacuation following any penetration, abandoning potentially repairable vehicles rather than risking ammunition fires. Wet stowage crews demonstrated greater willingness to remain in penetrated vehicles, assess damage, fight fires if necessary, and continue engaging if the tank remained operational. This improved crew confidence translated directly into enhanced combat effectiveness, as tanks remained in action longer and crews fought more aggressively, knowing that penetration did not automatically mean death. The wet stowage modification could not prevent armor penetration or eliminate all fire risk. German anti-tank guns, firing armor-piercing ammunition at combat range, could still penetrate Sherman armor, particularly the thinner side plates. Hits that struck engine compartments, fuel tanks, or hydraulic systems could still cause fires unrelated to ammunition ignition. Crews could still be killed or wounded by penetrating projectiles, spalling fragments, or blast overpressure. However, wet stowage eliminated the single most common cause of catastrophic vehicle loss and crew death, transforming the Sherman from a tank that probably burned when penetrated into one that probably survived. The demonstrated effectiveness of wet ammunition stowage created urgent demand from armoured units still operating dry stowage, Shermans in combat zones. Tank crews, who had witnessed wet stowage tanks survive penetrations that would have destroyed earlier vehicles, petitioned commanders for priority assignment to modified tanks or requested field retrofits of their existing vehicles. Unit commanders forwarded these requests through operational channels, creating pressure on supply and ordnance organizations to accelerate wet stowage implementation across all Sherman variants in the European theater. The United States Army's Ordnance Department responded by initiating a comprehensive field retrofit program during late 1944 and early 1945. This program aimed to modify existing dry stowage Shermans already deployed in Europe, rather than waiting for these vehicles to be replaced gradually through normal attrition and resupply with new wet stowage tanks from American factories. Field modification required shipping wet stowage conversion kits to forward maintenance facilities, training maintenance personnel in installation procedures, and coordinating vehicle withdrawal from combat units for modification work. Ordnance supply depots in France and Belgium received containerized wet stowage kits beginning in November 1944. Each kit included the water-jacketed, ammunition containers, mounting brackets, hull floor reinforcement plates, necessary fasteners and seals, antifreeze solution for filling water jackets, and technical instructions for installation. The kits were designed for installation by unit-level maintenance personnel using standard shop tools without requiring specialized equipment or factory-level facilities. Installation typically required 40 to 60 hours of work per vehicle, depending on the specific Sherman variant and the experience level of maintenance crews performing the modification. Technicians had to remove existing sponson ammunition racks, cut and drill hull floor plates to accept new mounting brackets, install reinforced floor sections to support water-filled container weight, position and secure the wet stowage containers, connect water fill and drain points, test all seals for leaks, fill containers with antifreeze-treated water, and verify proper ammunition loading and extraction from the new floor-mounted racks. Forward maintenance companies established rotation schedules that pooled tanks from frontline units for wet stowage modification while providing temporary replacement vehicles to maintain unit strength. This rotation system allowed continuous modification progress without completely withdrawing entire units from combat operations. Maintenance facilities worked around the clock during periods of reduced combat activity, particularly during winter weather that limited major offensive operations, to maximize the number of vehicles receiving wet stowage before spring campaigns began. The field retrofit program encountered predictable difficulties related to parts availability, maintenance facility capacity, and coordination with tactical operations. Some ordnance supply depots received insufficient quantities of conversion kits to meet demand from units in their support areas. Maintenance companies sometimes lacked adequate covered workspace for modification during harsh winter weather. Combat operations occasionally prevented planned vehicle withdrawals when tactical situations required maximum available armor strength. Despite these challenges, the retrofit program modified several thousand Shermans between November 1944 and April 1945, substantially increasing the proportion of wet stowage-equipped tanks in operational units. By March 1945, approximately 70% of Sherman tanks in European theater. Combat units featured wet ammunition stowage either through factory installation in newly produced vehicles or through field retrofit of earlier tanks. This represented a remarkable achievement in military logistics and industrial coordination, transforming the fleet composition of deployed armor in an active combat theater within less than 1 year of wet stowage's initial introduction. The remaining 30% of dry stowage tanks were concentrated primarily in units serving in relatively quiet sectors or in reserve formations, awaiting commitment to combat operations. Tank crews in units that received wet stowage modifications through field retrofit reported noticeable psychological relief and improved morale following conversion. Sergeant Robert Chen of the 4th Armored Division described the modification of his unit's tanks during January 1945 in letters preserved in division records. Chen noted that crews had lived with constant fear of ammunition fires since the unit's first combat in France during July 1944. Every penetration had been followed by frantic bailout as crews anticipated immediate conflagration. The wet stowage modification did not eliminate fear or make combat safe, but it removed the specific terror of burning alive that had dominated crew psychology during earlier fighting. The modification's psychological impact extended beyond individual crew confidence to affect unit-level tactical doctrine and operational planning. Battalion and regimental commanders demonstrated greater willingness to employ armor aggressively in close terrain or urban environments where German anti-tank weapons could engage at short ranges. The knowledge that penetrated tanks would probably survive and remain recoverable rather than burning completely reduced the calculated risk of armored operations in restricted terrain. This tactical flexibility proved particularly valuable during fighting in German towns and cities during winter and spring. 1945, when armor support was essential for reducing fortified positions. The wet ammunition stowage modification's success in reducing Sherman fire casualties influenced American armored vehicle design philosophy for decades following World War II. Post-war analysis of combat effectiveness consistently identified wet stowage as one of the most significant technical improvements implemented during the conflict in terms of lives saved per modification cost. The concept of protecting stored ammunition through isolation, thermal barriers, and fire suppression became standard practice in subsequent American tank designs, including the M26 Pershing, 46 pattern, M47 pattern, M48 pattern, and M60 series tanks that served through the Cold War period. Soviet tank designers, analyzing captured German intelligence reports on American wet stowage systems and examining Sherman tanks provided through Lend-Lease programs, adopted similar ammunition protection concepts in post-war designs. The T-54 and T-55 tanks that became the most widely produced tank designs in history featured ammunition stowage in floor-mounted positions with some fire protection features, though Soviet implementation differed in specific details from American approaches. British tank designers continued developing wet stowage concepts in post-war vehicles, including the Centurion, recognizing the demonstrated combat value of ammunition fire protection. The statistical evidence documenting wet stowage effectiveness became foundational data for operational research methodologies that analyzed combat effectiveness quantitatively. Military analysts used Sherman fire casualty data to demonstrate how systematic data collection and statistical analysis could identify specific technical problems, evaluate proposed solutions objectively, and measure actual combat outcomes. This analytical approach influenced post-war military planning, weapons development, and tactical doctrine across many areas beyond armored warfare. However, the wet stowage story also revealed limitations inherent in technical solutions to tactical problems. The modification substantially reduced fire casualties, but could not address other Sherman vulnerabilities, including relatively thin armor compared to German heavy tanks, gun performance inadequate for reliably penetrating, Panther and Tiger frontal armor at combat range, and size that made concealment difficult in open terrain. American armor remained dependent on numerical superiority, combined arms coordination, and air support to overcome German tanks possessing superior armor and firepower. Wet stowage saved lives and improved crew confidence, but did not fundamentally alter the tactical reality that Shermans were outmatched in direct engagements with German heavy armor. The modification's success in reducing casualties created unintended consequences for historical memory and post-war debates about American armored doctrine. Some military historians argued that wet stowage's effectiveness reduced pressure for more fundamental improvements in American tank design during the war. If Shermans had continued suffering catastrophic fire casualties at rates seen during summer 1944, pressure might have mounted for rapid deployment of heavier tanks with superior armor and armament. The wet stowage modification, by making Sherman combat service more survivable, potentially extended the type's service life and delayed introduction of more capable designs. This interpretation remains controversial among historians and veterans. Tank crews who benefited from wet stowage protection generally rejected suggestions that saving their lives represented a negative outcome that delayed better equipment. They argued that wet stowage provided immediate, tangible survival benefits, while hypothetical better tanks remained unavailable regardless of how many crews burned to death in Shermans. The modification represented the best available solution implementable within realistic time and resource constraints, addressing an immediate crisis that was killing soldiers daily. The wet stowage story demonstrates the complex relationship between technical innovation, industrial implementation, and combat effectiveness that characterized American military operations during World War II. The United States possessed industrial capacity to identify problems through systematic analysis, develop engineering solutions, implement modifications across thousands of vehicles, and measure actual combat outcomes quantitatively. This capability represented a crucial advantage over German forces that often produced technically superior individual designs, but lacked industrial capacity and logistical capability to field them in decisive quantities or sustain them operationally. Staff Sergeant Eugene Luciano, whose tank survived penetration near the Roer River in February 1945, continued serving with his unit through the final months of the European War. His crew fought in the Ruhr pocket encirclement, crossed into central Germany during April, and ended the war in Czechoslovakia. Luciano's tank was penetrated 2 additional times during this period, once by a German anti-tank gun and once by a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket. Neither penetration resulted in fire. His crew suffered 1 wounded member from spalling fragments, but no fatalities. The tank was repaired and returned to service after both incidents. In June 1945, following Germany's surrender, Luciano's unit assembled for demobilization processing at a former Wehrmacht facility in Bavaria. Maintenance personnel conducted final inspections of unit vehicles before their disposition as war surplus or shipment to Pacific theater operations. Luciano requested permission to photograph his Sherman, wanting a record of the vehicle that had kept his crew alive through nearly 1 year of continuous combat. The photographs, preserved in National Archives collections, show a battered M4 with multiple patched penetration holes in the hull, track damage from mine strikes, and scorch marks from a near miss by an 88mm round that had struck the engine deck without penetrating. What the photographs cannot show is the wet ammunition stowage beneath the turret basket that had prevented this particular tank from becoming another burnt-out hulk abandoned in a German field. Luciano understood intellectually that the water-jacketed containers had probably saved his life and the lives of his crew members multiple times. In letters written during the post-war occupation period, he reflected on the curious fact that his survival depended on engineering decisions made by ordnance officers and factory engineers he would never meet, working in facilities thousands of miles from any combat zone. The wet stowage modification saved thousands of American tank crew lives during World War II's final year. Precise casualty figures remain impossible to calculate definitively because they require determining how many crews survived. Penetrations in wet stowage tanks who would have died if those same tanks had featured dry stowage. Operational research estimates suggested the modification prevented approximately 3,000 crew deaths and serious burn injuries between August 1944 and May 1945, based on comparative casualty rates and the number of wet stowage tanks that suffered penetration. During this period, these saved lives represented sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers who returned home rather than being buried in European military cemeteries or dying decades later from burn injuries sustained in tank fires. The modification's value cannot be measured purely in statistical terms because each prevented death meant a family that remained intact, children who grew up with fathers, and futures that existed rather than being extinguished in a burning tank. The story of wet ammunition stowage reveals how warfare's decisive moments often occur. Far from battlefields in engineering laboratories, factory production lines, and logistics depots where unglamorous but essential work proceeds without recognition or dramatic narrative. German 75mm guns, aimed at Shermans throughout the war's final year, achieved penetration regularly. The difference between crew death and crew survival increasingly depended not on avoiding hits, but on technical modifications that prevented fires after penetration occurred. This represented a fundamental shift in armored warfare from preventing damage to surviving damage, from impenetrable armor to survivable penetration. The Sherman would never match the Panther's armor protection or the Tiger's gun performance. It did not need to. It needed to keep American crews alive when German rounds found their mark, then remain operational or repairable so those crews could continue fighting. Wet stowage accomplished this mission with remarkable effectiveness through simple engineering principles applied systematically across thousands of vehicles. The modification cost approximately $400 per tank in 1945 currency values for materials and installation labor. This represented one of history's most cost-effective life-saving interventions, measured in lives saved per dollar invested. No dramatic technological breakthrough was required. No revolutionary new materials. No complex systems beyond. The capability of field maintenance units to install and maintain water, metal containers, antifreeze, and systematic engineering analysis transformed the Sherman from a burning coffin into a survivable fighting vehicle. Staff Sergeant Eugene Luciano returned to civilian life in Pennsylvania during late 1945, resumed his pre-war employment as a machinist, married, raised 4 children, and died peacefully in 1993 at age 71. He lived nearly 50 years beyond that February morning when a German anti-tank round penetrated his Sherman near the Roer River, and the wet ammunition stowage prevented the fire that would have killed him. Those 50 years, and thousands of similar lives extended decades beyond World War II, represent wet stowage's true legacy beyond statistics and technical specifications. The morning of February 23, 1945, when penetration struck without catastrophic fire, marked not just Luciano's personal survival, but represented the culmination of engineering work, industrial coordination, and systematic problem-solving that characterized America's approach to armored warfare. German guns continued finding their marks. American crews increasingly survived those hits and continued fighting. In the unglamorous mathematics of attrition warfare, that difference proved decisive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.